We're here in Vienna at EGU 2019. My name's Keith Beven, and this is another in the series of History of Hydrology interviews that we've been doing for EGU. And this time I'm very pleased indeed to be able to introduce Tom Dunne from the University of California at Santa Barbara currently, who happens to be passing through Vienna, and so it was a really good opportunity to take to get this interview. But I do want to record for posterity that despite Tom's ridiculously youthful appearance and my grey beard, he is actually a few years older than me, which means that there was the possibility that when I was an undergraduate student that he was one of my early hydrological heroes, because I was still an undergraduate when the Dunne and Black papers came out in 1970 from his PhD thesis, but we'll get to that later. So if we can go back to the very beginning, Tom.
Okay.
You got interested in physical geography. How did that come about in your youth?
I think it's common for people to get interested in physical geography through their enjoyment of the outdoors.
Yeah.
I spent my teenage years hiking around, particularly the uplands of Britain.
Because we should say that you're originally from the north of England.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And also I grew up in a mining town.
Yeah.
And so geology was apparent.
Mm-hmm.
The miners would bring fossils up to trade for beer in my father's pub, so I got exposed to different kinds of plant fossils. I was taken down the mine when I was 15.
Right.
Spent a day scrabbling around on my hands and knees, like everybody else. And however, my father didn't want me to end up in the mine, so when I got back home, he sat me down, put a pint of beer in front of me and said, well, he said, your choice is clear. You either study hard or that's where you'll go.
Yeah.
So I was lucky that in my high school, they taught geology in addition to geography.
Right. Pretty unusual.
So I did 3 years of geology.
Right.
From mapping rocks in the Shropshire, Wenlock Edge, to Ingleborough, the limestone rocks. Petrographic microscope, all those sorts of things. So I originally was on my way to Cambridge to do geology, not geography.
Yeah.
But my geology teacher, who was a London product, misinformed me that geology at Cambridge was not very strong. But I thought, well, I'd still like to go to Cambridge, so I asked the college if they'd let me in for geography instead. So that's how I juggled the fact that I was interested in geography, but I was probably more interested in geology. But when I got the chance later in my career, I moved to a geology department, and I've always sort of enjoyed marrying both sides of that.
Sure.
That unfortunate dichotomy, because particularly in Britain, there's quite a sharp distinction between geology and geography, which is less true in the United States, but not untrue. But anyway, that's how I got into it.
Right. Okay. So you went to Cambridge. There must have been a bit of a culture shock coming from a mining town in the north, especially at that time.
Yeah, there was certainly cultural differences, but I think that my National Union of Mine Workers solidarity sort of approach prepared me fairly well to be able to dismiss the snottier aspects of Cambridge sociology. But that was still a minor aspect of Cambridge. I thought Cambridge was wonderful. I always did. It was beautiful. B, there was history around every corner. You go this way. You went past Charles Darwin's old rooms. You went that way. It was high Gothic of King's College Chapel and so on. but mainly it was that Cambridge was awash in ideas. Everywhere, people were talking about everything.
Yeah.
You go into college for dinner, stop off at the bar for a pint, and people talking about everything. Carry on that conversation in hall. Was a theologian over here, there's a physicist there. Everybody's talking. And so, and of course, also Cambridge was, outside of geography and geology. And don't forget also, the Cambridge geology was just beginning to get involved in plate tectonics. There's a, Vine and Matthews magnetic stripes on the seafloor. It was 1961, if I remember the paper correctly. So, but the fact that Cambridge was all about ideas made it very easy to be energized when Haggett and Chorley, in particular, in the geography department, told us that, as they would say in the United States, change is going to come. That geography generally and geomorphology specifically were in for a revolution.
Yeah.
And my attitude was, well, where's the revolution? Where do I go? What do I have to learn? I was ready to do that. And Chorley told me that following his own experience, he had gone to the United States for a master's degree. And then the plan was that I was supposed to go back to Cambridge for a PhD. But after I'd been in Johns Hopkins for a year, and I was able to take advantage of the classwork, the training that one could receive in an American graduate school.
Yeah.
I thought, if I stayed here long enough, I could actually get myself an education. And Mike Kirkby had spent was at Johns Hopkins the first year
already.
That I was there. He was on a postdoc, and so he began to tell me that those things like differential equations, and you could use them to relate the landscape to its controls and so on. And so I decided to stay on at Johns Hopkins and until I finished my PhD. Then I had to leave the country.
Yeah.
Because I had a Fulbright travel scholarship.
Right.
So
Yeah.
but,
Yeah, I mean, there's interesting overlap there because Peter Haggett, of course, moved to Bristol where I was an undergraduate, so taught me there, and Mike Kirkby moved to Bristol and taught me there and had much the same influence in terms of how to approach these systems and try and do some theorizing about them and so on.
Right.
But then, of course, you went back in the field. So how did that arise from doing your master's coursework at Johns Hopkins? I assume you had some contact with Reg Wolman and so on.
Well, I never actually did a master's. See,
right.
The idea was I would go there.
You just stayed on until the PhD.
I just went on and got a PhD.
Okay.
Right. But Reg Wolman was my graduate advisor.
Yeah.
And he was, Chorley, first of all, not to overlook the fact that I didn't go back to be supervised by Chorley, but he had a profound influence on me because he emphasized the significance of trying to develop general theory.
Yeah.
And although I went to the United States, where he had told me that the reason to go there was to learn empirical methods, but always with the idea of developing generalizations about landscape.
Because Leopold, Wolman and Miller's book was already out at that time.
Right. It came out the year that I graduated as an undergraduate.
Yeah. So how then did you end up doing the fieldwork in Vermont?
Well, my original thesis plan was I wanted to study chemical weathering because I thought that was the first step in mobilizing rocks so that the rock material would become malleable into a landform.
Yeah.
Right. So I started to learn the mathematics and the geochemistry and that sort of thing in that first year or two. But at the same time, Reds would take us out to Baseman Run, his catchment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I kept asking how the water was getting into the river. Now, I was interested in doing that because I knew it was fundamental to the whole chemical weathering
Fairly
issue.
critical, yes.
So anyway, I think probably just out of frustration, Reds gave me a preprint of what became the Hewlett and Hibbert 1965 Forest Hydrology Symposium paper.
Yeah.
And I read that, and I thought, seems like this is an avenue to follow, even if you have this geochemical aim. You know, I had done some lab leaching experiments at Hopkins to begin applying weathering geochemistry theories to water percolating down to a soil.
See what comes out.
So, but I thought, you know, I didn't really want to continue doing lab leaching experiments, so I would tackle this other problem. And Reds also was influential in the sense that he could put me in touch with the Agricultural Research Service of the Department of Agriculture, as it was called at that time. It's now called something else. I've forgotten the name of it. But Agricultural Research Service was the agency, and it had these experimental catchments strewn across the nation. So he first arranged for me to do a summer apprenticeship in the Reynolds Creek watershed in Idaho, and then to move to Vermont for my own PhD thesis. So that was the connection there.
Yeah. I didn't realise you'd been to Reynolds Creek that early on.
Yeah.
So you had to be a fairly big trench in Vermont to do those through. I remember there's a story about that.
Well, that's where having an Irish mining background came in handy. So, well, I met in Vermont, luckily for me, a man who was a man called Dick Black, who was on sabbatical from Cornell.
All right. Okay.
And they put both of us down in the basement of the experimental watershed office.
This is now for Sleepers River.
Sleepers River, it was called, and it's in northern Vermont, up on the divide between the St. Lawrence drainage and the Connecticut drainage. Yeah. And Dick was there just to sort of recover from not graduating, but becoming an associate professor, which is a bit of a trauma in the United States. So he was just there reading, and he and I would sit in the office some mornings, and he would ask me what I was doing there, and I had a funny accent, and so on. And we became quite close. And so I took him out to my field sites, by which I'd selected at that point. Heavily influenced, I might say, just thinking about another Hopkins connection, heavily influenced by the Hack and Goodlet paper on the how the plant form, topographic shape might have an influence on anything that moved on hillsides. So I showed him this site, and I was planning on small-scale Ron Whitkey style plot experiments.
Relatively narrow.
Right.
Yeah.
And Dick, who is a big, very strong engineer with a farming background, you know, looked at this hillside and he said, well, why don't you just measure all of it? And I would never have dared to tackle that just by myself.
Yeah.
So it ended up that Dick, an associate professor, and me, a graduate student, and a part-time, college student in between something, I forget what he was doing. We had 19 years of college between us. And we got 3 shovels out. And we dug this trench that was 300 feet long, 10 feet deep, and about 3 feet wide. And it drained out a planar slope, a concave slope, and a convex slope. And then we had some other low gradient plots on the other side of the valley in the same watershed. And so and it was getting to be late autumn. So in Vermont in those days, it was pretty cold at that time of year. We got there in the mornings with like 5 gallons of gasoline, pour it down the trench, throw a match in there and watch it burn. Oh, this was before the days of EPA, by the way.
Health and safety.
And then, and then we would get, we'd have a cup of coffee on the hill while the gasoline thawed out, and then we'd get in there with shovels. We had, again, because Dick was an engineer, it was engineered very well. We had forms to hold back the hill. Yeah, unfortunately, it was too steep.
Just as well.
Yeah, the problem was it was too steep to put an excavator on it, so we couldn't build it. We couldn't have an excavator to do it. So anyway, we did the trench. We put drains in and underground gauging stations with very highly machined weirs, so we can measure the discharge very well. Then we filled the trench in. Then we dug another trench 2 feet deep, immediately upslope of it, to the bottom of the topsoil, because the landscape, the hill was in grassland, but it had been a forest just 30 years earlier. So there was an intact forest topsoil, 2 feet deep. Yeah. So we put another set of pipes in at that level, and then we filled that in, and we built a surface trough layer, which was something I did not expect to use because I was Hewlett and Whipkey oriented. But anyway, we just, for safety's sake, we put it in. And the snow miraculously didn't happen. And we were sure the snow would come earlier than that, and we would have to abandon it for the winter, and I would start again in the spring. Lo and behold, we filled up the trenches, and we built a wooden roof over the top of everything so that rain couldn't get into the trench directly. And we finished it, and that night we had 16 inches of snow.
A bit of luck in that case, so you could connect
and then double lucky, because again, being English, I wasn't thinking about snow. But over the winter, the snow accumulated, and then lo and behold, in the spring, I had my first field experiment, because and the nice thing about snow is it happens slowly, and you can watch it and get yourself organized and so on. So I was doubly lucky, but I would not have been able to do any of that without Dick.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. So I was very, very lucky.
So that was the basis of both your PhD theses and those Dunne and Black 1970 Water Resources research papers that are so highly cited.
71, I guess.
And now nearly everybody gets taught about saturation excess, overland flow, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, I must say it was something of a surprise when it first happened. I mean, I thought through just the basic Darcy's law level range of options. So but I just didn't expect that the topsoil would actually get fully saturated. That's what surprised me. And then also on my other sites, I had deliberately chosen sites that were low gradient and had a thin, silty soil. I took advantage of the fluvial, the glacial fluvial stratigraphy of this watershed. That's why I chose the watershed. I didn't want to fight the stony, rocky hills in most of the watershed. I wanted to get something that was tractable. So I exploited the fluvial glacial stratigraphy, and so I wouldn't have been as surprised
So,
if the saturation of overland flow occurred first on the other side, but
yeah.
it was on.
But of course, that is quite different from where John Hewlett was working down at Coweta,
Absolutely.
and with the deep soils that they have there, and even some of his troughs that they put in didn't go down to the full depth of the soil in that case. But so
Yeah, so again, I was lucky basically that I had gotten this connection with the Agricultural Research Service north of the glacial boundary.
Yeah.
I remember Peter Wilcock asking me, would I have been so lucky if I'd stayed and done my thesis in Basement Run?
Yeah.
And I think the answer to that is it would have been much more subtle to recognize.
Mm-hmm.
Once you see it and you're looking for it, it's easier to see.
Yeah.
But being up on the glacial sediments, particularly the tills and the basal till, anyway, not the ablation till, that was quite sandy and permeable.
Mm.
But the basal till and the lacustrine varved sediments that were also there gave me this low transmissivity situation. So I could juxtapose you have deep permeable soils here, and you have low transmissivity soils there, and so geology and topography, or soils and topography, however you say it, allowed me to sort of extend the range of what I was able to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, just a perfect choice of site.
Well, I think also that's been the history of runoff studies in a way
Very often,
too, because gradually, even after I stopped working on this, well, of course after Vermont, I went to other places and looked at snow over permafrost. I looked at hot and overland flow in Africa and so on. But I think other people who were studying subsurface flow, like Dennis Haar in Oregon, and then Jeff McDonald, they went into progressively steeper and more permeable areas, and then even John had sampled in the Southern Appalachians.
Yeah.
So I think that's been the history that makes runoff studies still an interesting field. Karen Prestegard was telling me recently that she's working in Labrador on soils that are seasonally frozen, and I think that's another area that needs to be worked on and so on. So.
Did you have much contact with John Hewlett at that time?
Well, no, I didn't. I mean, during the work, I had known, but so the people who influenced me while I was doing my work were basically Ted Engman and Bob Reagan.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Because Bob had done a study of runoff production over in the Lake Champlain lowland.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, within about 6 months of my leaving, 6 months of my arriving in Vermont, they both left and they moved south. So I had a little bit of influence from them early on.
Ted continued some of the work, didn't he?
In Pennsylvania.
In Pennsylvania, right. Yeah.
But like I say, that was unfortunate that they left, but they came along, and I had good luck with that. But I had an amusing little experience when you asked about John, because at the end of my work, the director of the watershed, Martin Johnson, said that he'd like to have my work reviewed, because there was nobody else working on it on the watershed. It's like, you should get somebody in here to find out whether this guy is crazy or not. So he allowed me to put together a list of people to invite to just come and look, visit the watershed. So John was the first one on the list, of course.
Yeah.
But Ron Whitkey, Jim Smith, who was studying snowmelt runoff in the Sierra Nevada Forest Service lab. Bob Reagan came back. So maybe this is the unfortunate experience of a lot of over-eager graduate students. So I showed them all this stuff, and John was sort of at the back of the crowd looking fairly skeptical. And so I said to him in front of them, so what I think I have here is an illustration of your variable source concept, but with the extension into this geology that I just mentioned. Yeah. And he said, so this is, why a graduate student shouldn't presume. I should have checked this out before I said it to him publicly. He said, "No, you don't." And he I forget exactly the words he said about the existence of overland flow, but it just really turned him off. The idea that forested landscapes could be subjected to overland flow.
Yeah.
So I was chastened, to be honest about it. But then they all went away. I mean, it wasn't as if I was being persecuted or anything, but they went away. Yeah. He did a fairly hostile review on my manuscripts when they came out. And unfortunately, I never saw him again, except I corresponded with him once. And he said something that he thought that the Agricultural Research Service was trying to take away from the Forest Service the sort of leadership of runoff studies.
Right, yeah.
And so, in other words,
came across in his WRR commentary.
Oh, really? Well,
at that time, but
yeah, okay. I hadn't picked it up at that from that. I remember actually that commentary was in response not to my papers, it was in response to Al Freese's paper, 1972, because Al had used insights from my work and insights from John's work.
Yeah.
Tried to tie them together in a modeling context, which is what I thought was a great thing to do.
Yeah.
Anyway, John wrote this fairly cutting commentary, and I think both Al and I decided, let it go, we're off on other things, Because by that time, the other thing that made me not want to pursue those sorts of studies at the time is I did some experiments where I spread fertilizer onto areas that I knew would produce saturation overland flow. And I irrigated them because I had a big irrigation system that would irrigate 0.6 of an acre. Is a system I borrowed from a farmer. Right? Nice thing about living in a farming community.
Yeah.
So I demonstrated that these areas that could produce saturation overland flow could be what at that time was beginning to be called non-point source pollution.
Yeah.
In the Lake Erie is dying sort of days. So I wrote a little, I thought I was being a contributor, I had a little memo, I guess you call it, sort of a 5-10 page thing on these results, and said, and sent it off to our research investigations leader, it was called, Cecil Wadley, down in Beltsville, Maryland. And I said, look, a research idea that the Department of Agriculture could follow up on, saying, we understand the origin of non-point source pollution. Oh boy, that got me in trouble too. I got this letter back saying, agriculture, sounds pretty absurd today, but this was 1969.
Yeah.
Agriculture does not cause non-point source pollution. So I thought, okay, I mean, this is obviously not an environment in which I can flourish, right? And I had the opportunity to go out to Africa, so I was like, to heck with it. I don't want to participate in these interagency debates about whose idea was first or whatever, so I went off and did something else.
Ted Eggman did follow up some of that
Yeah.
stuff later with his modelling. So
Right, and he probably was, he was older than I. He knew the agency. He probably knew how to maneuver.
more politically well informed, yes.
Yeah, and not irritate people. I wasn't trying to be irritating. I was just naive. I sent off, hey, it's an
Trying to
idea.
make a contribution, as you said.
But there were other things in life to do.
I did get to visit the Sleepers River site many years later, but of course it's under a highway now.
Well, this is the only good thing I share with Stan Shum. We both had our thesis field areas destroyed by transportation networks.
Great pity, really. But I think you can probably still lay the claim to the longest through-flow trough in hydrological history. But,
300 feet.
I don't know that there's anybody done another one, none since. So, what happened after Vermont?
McGill University needed somebody to go off to East Africa, quote, to improve the teaching of geography, physical geography.
Right. Okay.
And they couldn't find anybody because all their young faculty had just gotten to North America and they were hanging on to the pier.
Yeah.
I'm not going anywhere. And so a friend of mine from Hopkins, who was teaching there, said, I know a guy who would go to Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So they called me and they interviewed me and sent me off to Africa to teach geography at the University of Nairobi.
Mm-hmm.
And but again, as an inducement, including amongst many other very nice inducements, they gave me a checkbook and said, if you want to do some research, do some research. And so I started. I was only going to be there initially for 1 year, but I begged for a second year.
Mm-hmm.
I begged for a third year, but they said, no, we want you to come back and start a hydrology program here. But anyway, that's when I started, just to get my eye in on the landscape. I started driving around Kenya from Lake Victoria to the Indian Ocean and up Mount Rainier, all the way around it, once a month, sampling streams for chemistry. And I started to delve into the old colonial networks of stream flow gauges and sediment samples, which there's no discussion of it continuing, but there are all these data. So I started to put together catchment scale syntheses of where the soil was being eroded from and where the solutes were coming from, because I still had a yen to go back and address this chemical weathering issue.
Yeah.
So I spent 2 wonderful years in there in Nairobi, broadening my mind. Beautiful landscape, lots of diverse, interesting people, different kinds of people, pastoralists and cultivators and so on. There's a very interesting expat community there as well. So it was one of the defining experiences of my life. And then I went back to Kenya to do more organized research on and off for 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Including some erosion studies with a sprinkler system, I seem to, an African style sprinkler system. I remember you telling a story once.
Well, yeah, I built my own rainfall simulator, but that was to do studies of the hydrology and the hydraulics of sheet flow. So I was following Horton by this time, and I did. I suppose in the United States you call it soil erosion studies, but although the initial motivation and the initial funding came from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization under the rubric of desertification research, because this was, in the days when deserts were spreading and so on. But by that time, I'd also moved to the University of Washington, and because of other connections there, I began to formulate my studies of hydrologic processes in terms of hill slope erosion and landscape evolution. So I was doing these experiments eventually with the idea of putting together a hill slope evolution by water erosion model, which I'm still working on, by the way. But on the other hand,
you're doing better than me because I haven't still got the water right,
Yeah.
going to the sediments
well,
and the
but you see,
chemistry.
that's what I get. So I found out, for example, that in doing these experiments, I thought I'll just measure infiltration capacity right there in the book. It's a single variable.
Yeah.
Well, and I found out that actually, no, the infiltration capacity, even the final, Hortonian F sub C, is a scale-dependent term that depends upon, well, first of all, the rainfall intensity and the vegetation density, but also the depth of the flow, and the depth of the flow is increasing downstream, downslope.
Yeah.
And that affects the progressive inundation of more and more permeable microtopography.
Yeah.
Actually increases the average infiltration capacity monotonically downslope. So rainfall intensity minus infiltration capacity is not a constant variable. It's a scale-dependent variable. So Q does not equal Kx.
Yeah.
Right? It equals as a function of x to a power, if you like. And because this result came from generalizing the experiments to hill slopes longer than my 6 meter long plot.
Yeah.
But eventually you can get far enough down a hill to where the infiltration capacity will absorb all the rainfall, and the rain and the discharge does not increase any farther with distance downslope. So I also am still struggling with the just getting the water right, but I also been trying to get the sediment transport part right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, that's why I was doing rainfall experiments, and I built this thing that it was about 5 meters high, and I could put different nozzles on it to get different drop sizes and alter the infiltration, the intensity as well as the drop size, and I could pick it up and carry it around, or at least I and 4 or 5 other guys that were helping me. Working in game parks, you get free labor from rangers who were taking a break from other things,
including to move the nozzle backwards.
Yeah,
I remember a photograph of that system.
Well, that actually we did that because we had two ropes. We pulled the nozzles backwards and forwards fairly quickly. Just try to get over the fact that if you have a characteristic drop size, characteristic of say intense rainfalls in the tropics, then the rainfall intensity is way too high, so you have to interrupt the flow a little bit. And we got quite a few Maasai would come around to look at what we were doing.
What on earth he was doing,
crazy, these crazy white guys. They'd come and they'd build this machine and then turn it on and spray water on the ground, and then they'd throw off their clothes and get underneath the water and start measuring what was going on in 5 millimeters of flow. I was like, what do you crazy guys do? So anyway, a couple of them were intrigued enough to want to participate. A couple of young Morani, the warriors. And so I said, okay, we'll pay you. And they said, well, actually what we want is, and they pointed to Brian Aubrey, my graduate students, boxer shorts, which were patterned boxer shorts.
Right.
So sure enough, he still had a couple of pairs of clean ones. And for the price of 2 pairs of boxer shorts, which I suspect is what you've seen the photographs of.
Absolutely.
Okay,
yeah.
well that's it. Yeah. And then the other thing was I had Africa was also, because as I said, a very interesting place. And there were lots of other environmental scientists working there, but they were all mainly large mammal biologists.
Right.
And one of them is one of my oldest friends. I still see him and his wife, who's one of my oldest friends also, every year, and is a man called David Weston. And we would, from time to time, help one another out with our experiments. You know, sometimes I remember once they were doing a study of how tourist vehicles crossing the playa would cause wind erosion that would transport saline dust over the vegetation.
Right.
And we designed an experiment to measure that. My role in that, since I was not one of the ace biology team, my job is I was given a big stick, and every time the baboons came out of the bush to grab the plates that we were using to catch the aeolian deposition, I was to go behind them. And so another one that we came up with was there was this question of exactly how does heavy grazing by cattle, because there were cattle as well as large herds of wild grazers, and exactly how does the cattle cause soil erosion? Is it by reducing the ground cover, by eating it, or is it by trampling? And we had a paper, David's PhD advisor, Colin Pennicue, was a physicist who worked on various ecological problems, and he's written a paper called The Walking of the Gnu. It's about the mechanics of wildebeest trampling, and also just any ungulate trampling. So we took this paper about how an ungulate would put down his or her foot, and what the pressures would be, and what the stride length would be, and all the rest of it. And we calculated how far, we knew from John and David Weston's monitoring how far cattle walked every day. Knew the stride length. We knew, therefore, how many hoof prints it would be required per unit area of soil. And then we needed to get the feet. Right? And there was an intense drought on, so there were dead cows everywhere. So we went in and we sawed the hoofs off a dead cow. We attached them to we made a pair of wooden clogs from wood and the inner tube of Land Rovers. And we figured out that, again, we knew the weight of a cow, the herd average weight, and we knew that, so the herd average weight of a cow was about 2 times the weight of a large graduate student. And the cow had just about 2 times as many feet. So we got this graduate student, put the hooves on him, and made him walk up and down
under the sprinkler
thousands of times on these plots, to simulate different intensities of cattle stocking. So then we put these, then we sort of prepared the plots this way. We put out a rainfall simulator over the various plots with the various treatments, and then we also continued to monitor the response of the soil and the runoff and soil erosion throughout another wet season, because we simulated a wet season, and we kept all the grazers out by building a thorn fence around it. And nice to have Messiah around to show you how to do it.
The expertise to do
exactly. So you take advantage of whatever you got.
Yeah.
So that was so you do they're not defining, it's not purely saying develop general theory.
Yes.
Right? But it's nice to have friends who are doing interesting things, and you have fun doing experiments.
Yeah, I think thinking about the longer term of your career, you've always done that in various different environments. But
I've never been able to get away from biologists. I got to the Pacific Northwest, and they're all studying fish. Fish in the Pacific Northwest is all about gravel-bedded rivers and landslides.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Geomorphology and hydrology comes in rather useful. Yeah. Yeah. So we sort of skipped over where you've been moving. So you were in Africa. You went back to McGill for a while, and then to Seattle. Is that the order?
Right.
Yeah.
I spent a couple of years in McGill studying snowmelt runoff on the boreal forest tundra boundary in northern Labrador. And then I went out to Seattle.
Mm-hmm. And stayed there for 20 years or
22 years.
Guess, yeah,
and that was the time that I got back into geology.
Yeah.
And that radically changed my my work, because before that, it's normal within a geography program. You can think about processes, and you think about land use and man-land connections and so on. But when I got to Seattle, and I was surrounded, first of all, I was in a quaternary research center.
Yeah.
And I was surrounded by a very active landscape, recently deglaciated, tectonically active, volcanologically active. So it was very easy to think of the other two legs of Davis's tripod of landforms being the product of structure, process, and stage. So here was the geomaterials and stage, and the Quaternary Research Center, they were thinking about how to date things. So I, at that point, became more involved with landscape evolution and landscape functioning, and less involved in land use effects and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Also, because there was an interactive geophysics program there, I ran into this man, Jim Smith, who taught me environmental fluid mechanics. So again, I was miraculously lucky to stumble into these people,
Yeah.
So that Jim helped a lot. And we had fabulous graduate students, because Link Washburn, who established the Quaternary Research Center, made it a place where young people would want to come. And so people like Jim and like me and Bernard Halle, Steve Porter, John Adams, and so we were able to take advantage of all these
really attractive people
students coming in.
Yeah.
And then a wonderful landscape to do these things, but we could all interact. So I could teach a geomorphology course that took some advantage of Jim's continuum mechanics course and his sediment transport course, and so on. All kinds of interactions like that.
Yeah.
So it was, I would say, my African experience was maybe the defining experience of my life until I got married and had kids. But it broadened my mind tremendously. But professionally, the Washington experience was the defining aspect of my career.
That's actually where we first met, because there was the Theoretical Hydrology conference in Fort Collins in '77, and I took advantage of that to first go up to see Al Fries, another one of my undergraduate heroes or graduate student heroes, in Vancouver, where he was. I'd already moved to then, and then come down to see you.
Yeah.
Although the US immigration nearly didn't let me in because I didn't have a return ticket out of the United States, but we did get together there at least then.
Probably wouldn't get in at all today.
Well, probably wouldn't get in at all today, no. So you stayed in Seattle for quite a long time, but then moved down to Santa Barbara. How did that come about, really?
Yeah, because that, people still ask me 24 years later, why did you leave Seattle? You had the best job in geomorphology. And it was the same sort of weakness that had gotten me there. I was very happy in Montreal. But Link Washburn presented the vision of a new place that was trying to do new things. And oh, by the way, if you look outside my living room window, that is Mount Rainier in the morning sunshine. So Jeff Dozier, in this case, said, hey, this is in a bar in Phoenix, said, hey, I'm starting a new school of environmental science and management. And he presented a vision of, trying to train young people in a professional master's environment, something like an MBA in environmental problem solving that would integrate the kinds of things that he and I taught with economics and law and that sort of stuff. And so I went down to look and made the distinct error of taking my wife and kids with me. And the first morning they saw Santa Barbara, that was it. So that's why I moved down there.
Right.
So,
well, Jeff could be pretty persuasive.
He was extremely persuasive.
Yeah.
I mean, I had already bought the Kool-Aid about the vision.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, well, again, I came over to Santa Barbara for 3 months in '96. Yeah. And looking back, I hadn't realised it was so close to you moving down there, actually. But,
I wasn't settled there at that time.
Yeah.
I mean, I was still trying to...
The program was just
get a lab together and figure out what should be taught to these people.
And so on,
You can't just start out, as you can, say, teaching at the University of Washington to confirmed graduate students. You can really start with F equals ma, get to Newton's second law applied to a sheet of water running over the surface, and go on from there. And they're with you. But in this other group, they're not curious about what you have to offer. They're interested in solving problems.
Yeah.
They're really management oriented. So they're very skeptical about you. And Jeff and I taught this Earth System Science course. So our job at the beginning of every lecture for 20 odd years was to convince people before we started trying to teach them that F equals ma, as it applies to Darcy's law, for example, that there's something in it for them to just concentrate for a few minutes here. So it completely inverted how I teach.
Although you already had the water and environmental planning book, was that already out there?
Oh yeah, it was out way. I mean,
before that, yeah,
15 or more years before that. But you see, it wasn't about that. You see, this was Earth System Science. So Jeff said right from the beginning, when he founded the school, that they were going to be the first environmental management students to understand the global significance of the Earth as a planet, and how it would affect everything that they would seek to manage. And so Jeff starts out with there is a sphere rotating in space, and there's radiation, and from all that he develops why CO2 is a nuisance to be managed.
Yeah.
Right? And I had the same thing, that say, well, this planet accumulated water, and where is the water? How did it get to be, how did so much of it get to be now called an ocean, and how much is left on the continents, and what does it do when it's on the continent? So it was at that level we taught that course. So water and environmental planning wasn't much used to me. It was when I taught a course called watershed management. But in that Earth System Science course, we had no textbook.
But if we could just pick up on the book a bit, because we missed out your initial contact with Luna Leopold, who was the co-author of that book. Can we sort of just go back to that? So, because you acted, I think, as a field assistant to Luna with the USGS fairly early on in your career. Well before that.
Again, it's why, every morning you should waken up expecting, or at least hoping, to be lucky. And if you are lucky, you should get on it. So my apartment mate at Johns Hopkins was Bill Emmett.
Yeah,
Bill had been his assistant. Bill had been Luna's assistant. So at the end of our 2 years of coursework, I was helping Bill to move his books back into his office in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. He was going to go off and do his own thesis on sheet wash hydraulics.
Yep.
And so I was moving in, and I was moving books in, and Luna walks in and says, "Hi, I'm Luna Leopold. Who are you?" And he always was very interested in young people.
Mm-hmm.
You know? So, what are you doing? And I said, I'm going off to Vermont. I'm going to work on this question about how water gets in the stream. And he said, it's very interesting. Tell me more, and what are your ideas, and what are your plans, and so on. And then, fine. The next time I met him, I had flown down overnight to defend my thesis in Baltimore. And because my airplane was diverted for snow and ice overnight, I had landed in New York Airport, and I spent the night sleeping in the cold with the homeless people on the railway station in New York City. Mm-hmm. Next morning, I jump on the train. My thesis defense is scheduled for like 10:30 or something.
You still got to get down from New York.
So I got down there early because I didn't get a lot of sleep that night. It was really cold. And ran and got a shower and a shave at somebody's house, and walk in bleary-eyed, and all of a sudden, oh my God, sitting in the middle of my defense is the biggest hydrologist in the world. I think, what on earth, you know? So I gave my halting performance, you know, and so anybody have any questions, says my advisor. Great big hand with its 8 ounces of gold bracelet rises in the air, and I'm shrinking into my socks, you know. Oh my God, I'm not in for it. John Hewlett was not anywhere near this much of a threat. And Luna said, I think this is one of the most interesting pieces of hydrology I've seen. And the whole place was overwhelmed by his presence anyway. Yeah. Nobody dared ask a question. all I got were congratulatory questions. Oh, since your nice study is what, you know. So then Luna said to me, what are your plans? And I said, well, I'm going to McGill for just temporarily. I'm going off to Africa. But he said, why don't you come and work for me in the snowmelt season, because I need somebody to be pulling bedload samples out of the East Fork River while I'm chief hydrologist in Washington.
Right.
So I spent a wonderful summer in Wyoming. So we started an interaction that way. He would come out, little busman's holiday, and watch as we pulled samples out. Mm-hmm. But he was commuting.
Before they had the conveyor belt system?
The conveyor belt system, which Bagnold and Luna had designed, had turned out not to be sufficiently rugged, and so it had plugged up within the first few minutes, and it was down there in the river. But my goal was to my role was to solve, to be the replacement.
Yeah.
Until they could get a new, more rugged one in there. Yeah. So I spent the summer in Wyoming, and then I went off to Africa at that point. But then Luna had stopped being the chief hydrologist soon after I left. And he was on a round-the-world tour, looking at experimental watersheds in New Zealand and places like that. He stopped off in Nairobi for 10 days, stayed with me and with his wife. And I took him around the landscape and then showed him different things, and we just chatted about geomorphology and birds and wild animals, and I was doing all the white hunter story stuff, telling him how lions worked and that kind of stuff, all of which I'd learned from David Weston. Of course, I didn't have any independent expertise, but we bonded over that, and he visited me again. And then I got back to McGill, and he visited. It was on another visiting professorship in Canada. So he visited, and I took him down to Vermont, back to the farm that I had lived on throughout my 3 years of research up there. And we were maple sugaring. And one evening, as we were waiting for dinner to be prepared after a day of slogging around on the snowshoes with buckets of sap in our hands, he said, "So, what are you writing these days?" It was always very much "Are you turning your stuff out?" And I said, "Well, I've been working on this book that I started in Nairobi when I didn't have a textbook, and I said, I don't know what will become of it, but I've been pushing that manuscript forward because I'm teaching hydrology now at McGill." So he said, "Oh, well, why don't we work on that together and finish the book together?"
Why not?
If his name's on the book, maybe it will will sell. And so I used to pull his leg about it. As I said, this will always be called, since I'd already written probably 2/3 of the book. It was obvious, my name would go first. That was, from the beginning. We didn't negotiate. It was just, he was, joining an ongoing concern. But I always used to pull his leg about the fact that the book would always be called Leopold and Dunne. And he would say, "No, I forget about it." But I remember the first time I saw reference to it in print. I remember I was flying on a plane to Denver. And it was a beautiful sunny day. I remember it so clearly. And I saw this. It said, "Leopold, 1978." I thought, that's fitting, because there's such an imbalance. I mean, who the heck is this guy done? So that was, but it was a very. I learned a tremendous amount from Luna. But I never did research with him at all.
No. Apart from dragging bedload out of.
But that was his work. I mean, I just bagged out the samples and left it to him at that point. Sure.
I mean, you've talked about being lucky with sites and being lucky with people, but you've also been lucky with events to some extent. And in Seattle, you happened to be there when Mount St. Helens went up.
Right.
So that led to quite a research program. Yeah.
Well, I was actually on the point when it blew up. I had a graduate student, Lee Fairchild, and Lee wanted to study lahars. And we had a plan to go down to a volcano in Guatemala, which in the summer had intense tropical rainstorms and fairly frequent lahars. So it was our plan, and we were writing a proposal to study lahars. And then Mount St. Helens blew up, and I thought, well, there's no way we're going to get any money for us to leave the country. So, I remember I had to put my hand in my pocket and rent helicopter time because we couldn't get in. The whole place was closed off. And once we got into the area, you looked around and all the geomorphological things that would happen. It was very clear that whatever the petrologists were making out of, and the volcanologists were making out of that event, 90% of all the interesting geology was the geomorphology. And so I had, the Geological Survey were already studying the big debris avalanche that slid off the side and ran down the valley at 200 or 300 kilometers an hour. So there wasn't much point in trying to compete with Barry Voigt, if you're studying that. But the lahars were fantastic and huge. So we studied the origin and the flow behavior of the lahars. And then there was volcanic ash and all these new sediments around that were eroding at tremendous rates. So I had a graduate student work on tephra erosion, Brian Collins. We've just submitted a manuscript, however it's been 30 odd years after, on the last decade or so we monitored the tephra erosion for 25, 30 years after that.
Yeah.
So again, it was just too big an opportunity to avoid. And again, I was talking about lucky with people. Because I worked on this active volcano while it was still burping and being active, Japanese scientists flocked over to watch. And as a result, I bonded with them. And as I discovered by return visits, how advanced Japanese geomorphology was, and particularly analytical geomorphology. It's when I became since a career-long friend of Masashige Hirano, and Okunishi, and Hiroshi Suwa, and so on. So, they hadn't published much in English. I mean, I think Masashige had published maybe one paper in Journal of Geology. And I took Bill Dietrich over with me because he was still a graduate student at that time. And we were walking around in these Japanese landscapes, very active volcanoes, landslides, and so on, and talking to the Japanese about their analytical approach to that, which they hadn't really subjected us to in the West. So I learned a tremendous amount from them about analytical geomorphology, but also about volcanoes and then volcano geomorphology. Yeah. And so now working on debris flows, I'm back again to learning what reapplying and building on what I learned from the Japanese about debris flows.
And that's the most recent lucky event you
Yeah.
just in Santa Barbara. Quite recently,
sure.
Another big debris flow that came pretty close to your house.
Yeah. Well, so I retire.
Yeah.
And I go off to Saudi Arabia to see my daughter. And while I'm away, there's a wildfire. And I'm watching the wildfire spread across the mountain front right outside my house and thinking the house is gone. We got back and we were locked out. Fire came within a kilometer of the house. But we thought, okay, that's lucky. And then 3 weeks later, there was an intense rainstorm, very intense rainstorm, only 12 minutes long. And it kicked off these very large debris flows in five canyons coming off the mountains right outside our living room window. And the flow came towards us, but was diverted by the fault escarpment that we live on. So it came within about, I would guess, 400 meters of the house. But that's horizontally. We were quite safe because we were 30 to 50 meters above. But if that sort of thing happens in your hometown, first of all, it's devastating to the community. I mean, just hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage and 23 people killed. And the town left thinking, what do we do now? And looking for some kind of advice and so on. So I put aside my retirement plans for research, which were, stately progression through my old Amazon research and my old African research. I had started reducing data in preparation for a gentlemanly retirement. But instead, I started out with my wife's help surveying mudlines on trees and canyon sides from ridgetop to the ocean, 10 kilometers long. Each of these debris flows was about 1,000 meters of fall and about 10 kilometers of horizontal movement down the canyons, scouring the channels, picking up big boulders weighing up to 100 tons, distributing them across the debris floor fans that the town of Montecito is built on. So, yeah, I couldn't avoid that.
Yeah.
Just so it was fortunate, at least for me.
Yeah.
And so now I'm still continuing on working on that.
You mentioned the data from the Amazon there. That's something else we haven't. Well, there's probably lots of things we haven't talked about, but that's something that also goes back to the University of Washington, doesn't it? You started that. I know there was a big project at that time that started to get you down in the Amazon.
Right. Again, friendships. My friend Jeff Ritchie was ginning up this study of the limnology of the Amazon, because he thought that the big tropical rivers and their floodplains might play a role in the missing gigaton of carbon in the global carbon budget. And Jeff, is a hydrochemist, so he was going to sample the rivers, and he was advised that it would be good to have someone who knew something about water flow and the fact that some of the carbon was particulate, so it was a sediment transport problem.
Yeah.
So he got me involved, and along with Bob Mead from the Geological Survey.
Yeah.
So Bob and I did the sediment transport in the channel together. But I was always, it was fine to be locked on this boat for 6 weeks, cruising up and down the river, measuring the sediment that was in the river channel. But I never thought that was particularly interesting. I was more intrigued about the fact that obviously there were very large exchanges of sediment going on between the floodplain and the channel.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I got involved with, I had a new graduate student, Lael Mertis, and we got involved with trying to take apart the channel floodplain exchanges. And, that we published some stuff on that. I've been actually digging back into that, trying to build a stochastic model of floodplain channel sediment exchanges to find out about how long it takes sediment to move down the entire Amazon from the Fallen Basin, the east of the Andes. But then I got intrigued by the fact that I had another grad student came along and wanted to study Amazon deforestation, hydrologic effects of Amazon deforestation. Liz Safran. That spoke to my old days of small catchment experiments and rainfall simulations and so on. So I spent several years working on runoff processes again, in intact forest and in pastures. But gradually I was drawn back to the sediment problem, and I got interested in where the sediment was coming from to get into the Amazon. So we went off, Liz and I went off to the Andes in Bolivia and worked on how the incision of the Andes is releasing the sediment into the Fallen Basin, east of the active origin. And then went down to the Fallen Basin, and there was the Garden of Eden of untouched rivers. Nobody living down there because the rivers move around so quickly that they can't settle on the riverbanks. And so I had another very enthusiastic grad student, Rolf Alto, and Rolf and I got interested in channel and floodplain exchanges as the sediment moves from the canyon coming out of the Andes across the Fallen Basin. So we would take small boats and we'd go down the Beni and the Mamoré rivers for about 3 weeks, just camping on riverbanks and macheting our way off into the floodplain to drill cores of floodplain sediment. Rolf became quite expert in doing lead-210 dating. And so we put together a sediment budget of floodplain exchanges for those rivers, and also got into the whole issue of how do the channels evolve over time in such an active area of river that were meandering and also subject to chute cutoffs and neck cutoffs and so on. So that was the Amazon.
And still a lot to be written up.
We still have things to write up about that.
You talked about a number of graduate students, and you've had lots of them in your time. But one of the things that's always impressed me when I've had contact with your group is how you've managed to sort of engender the group dynamics for the graduate students in particular, having paper review sessions, usually with a few beers and other things going on, and on a fairly regular basis.
That's something I picked up from Res Wolman.
Right. Okay.
And the reason for doing it around the fire at home and over beer and then afterwards dessert.
Ah, yes, I remember the dessert's rather important too.
Is, if you run a seminar inside the institution, everybody's looking at their watch, and okay, we've got 45 minutes or 50 minutes, and got to get out of here. Our thing at home was we would take one paper per week and try to take the whole thing apart. And take about 2.5 hours. Take it apart in the sense of a critique that's like English professors. They do literary criticism. Right? That's not criticism as in criticizing the paper. No. It's disassembling it and finding out what are the components of it, working through the mathematics. So this was to make sure that the students realized. Unfortunately, I see a lot of students these days who don't get this. They read a paper that has a lot of math in it. They go, oh, well, he did some math, and this is the answer. But this was, well, wait, do you understand that? Yeah. And if you had to do the math, could you do it? How are the equations formulated? How do you get from the idea to the formulation? Exactly. So, and then, at the end, again, from Res Wolman, no matter how, even paper you saw quite a lot of blemishes with, you put it together and you say, yes, but what have we learned from this paper? And was it a good topic to study? Was it a tractable topic to study? Was it a topic that would be tractable within the limitations of a 3-year PhD program? So all of those other surrounding issues, apart from just, this is science, this is a paper, read it, do the same thing. We got to spend about 4 hours a night talking about all issues surrounding it. And people would show up at the seminar like Doug Burbank and Ed Keller and Oliver Chadwick. And so, we'd have like 5 faculty members and Bodo Buchhagen postdocs, as well as grad students. And they took it every year, not at my request. They demanded to have that seminar.
It's such a valuable learning experience.
They enjoyed interacting with one another.
Yeah.
So it was a great thing. We had, many of those graduate students that they're well known in literature now. They were all just interacting with one another.
Like that. Yeah.
Sure. I didn't think of it as I was training them. I thought that everybody was interacting.
Well, I think it's a valuable thing that other people can take advantage of. Certainly I have in my time.
It takes time, and it takes a very...
Even though one of the papers that was discussed was one of mine when I was there. But,
it takes time, and it takes a very supportive spouse.
As well, yes. Yeah. Well, Joan is certainly that. So.
With great dessert-making skills.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we've covered nearly everything that I wanted to cover today with you, Tom. Thanks you very much. It's been a really fascinating interview, and let's hope it turns out okay.